The image you are seeing is one of the most terrible and iconic of the 20th century. It was taken in 1968 in the middle of the Vietnam War and is a perfect synthesis of the level of brutality reached during the war. Here we see a South Vietnamese Army soldier shooting a member of the Viet Cong in the head. The victim's name is Nguyen Van Lem, and he is 36 years old. He puts his hands behind his back because he is handcuffed. Until a few moments ago, he was a prisoner who should have been treated with respect and dignity, in accordance with international military regulations. His death is a crime, and his executioner will pay the consequences of this act. However, this story is much more complex than it seems, because there are no heroes or villains here. And Nguyen Van Lem is hiding a horrific secret, and his executioner is convinced that he is doing the right thing by coldly killing him. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will reveal to you the truth behind the most infamous photograph of Vietnam. To understand this history, we have to analyze the famous Tet Offensive of 1968. By this date, the United States had been directly involved in the affairs of Vietnam for 3 years. The nation was torn by a civil war between the Communist North and the capitalist South, allied with Uncle Sam. The Americans were convinced that thanks to their powerful weapons and well-trained army, they would obtain a quick and easy victory, but this ended up being an illusion. The fight bogged down as the Northerners proved to be a tough nut to crack. It was not easy to fight against the Viet Cong guerrillas, who, in addition to knowing the terrain, had the support of the country's rural population. This was because United States troops used to carry out attacks against peasant villages, like the one you will see below.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about. The old and the very young. The Marines have burned this old couple's cottage because fire was coming from here.
These types of actions turned the rural inhabitants in favor of communist Vietnam. Towards January 1968, the Vietnam confrontation took such a significant turn that it completely changed the course of the conflict. The North Vietnamese High Command planned a titanic military operation, the objective of which was to deal such a severe blow to their enemies that they could not recover. The attack would take place during Tet, the day of the Lunar New Year and one of the nation's most important holidays. They chose this date since no one would expect a military offensive to coincide with this traditional celebration, in which all Vietnamese families would be celebrating. The plan was to attack the main cities of the South, causing so much damage that the Americans had no choice but to negotiate a surrender. During the party, there would be so much movement of people traveling from one place to another to meet their loved ones that no one would suspect the guerrillas infiltrating the cities. The Tet Offensive began on January 30th with attacks in the towns of Saigon, Hue, and Khe Sanh. In all cases, the communists proceeded in the same way. They went through the streets dressed as civilians, hiding heavy weapons under their clothes. They were heading to government buildings, which were a symbol of South Vietnamese power and authority. Once they were in position, they unsheathed grenade launchers and mortars and bombarded the buildings. The most important attacks were carried out in the city of Saigon. There, the Viet Cong captured the radio station for the recording of a speech by Ho Chi Minh, the legendary leader of the North. The guerrillas remained locked in the building for 6 hours, shooting at enemy troops who wanted to enter to evict them. Finally, seeing that they were surrounded and had no escape, they committed suicide by detonating an explosive that destroyed the station. The streets of Saigon sank into chaos and anarchy. The sky was covered by the black smoke of explosions. the sidewalks overflowed with dead and wounded, and the air became saturated with the thunderous noise of screams and gunfire. Citizens couldn't believe what was happening. Let's listen to the testimony of a survivor of the attack.
It came as a total shock because we always thought Saigon was safe. The safest place in all of South Vietnam.
The South Vietnamese government mobilized its troops along the streets. They advanced in their armored vehicles, with rifles on their shoulders, ready to open fire on any suspect. One of the many soldiers who fought against the Viet Cong on that day was Nguyen Ngoc Loan, the same one who appears in the photo executing the prisoner. In a matter of hours, this man would become one of the most famous murderers in history. Let's know Loan's history, since he was one of the key men of the Southern Armed Forces. He was born in December 1930 into a middle-class family, and in his youth he studied to be a pharmacist. However, the turbulent political situation in his country, which was embroiled in a civil war, led him to enlist in the aeronautics, where he became an airplane pilot. In the conflict that tore Vietnam apart, Loan always fought for the pro-capitalist side. In fact, part of his training was done in the United States, where he also learned to speak English fluently. In the 1960s, he rose through the military ranks until he reached the rank of general. It is important to note that he was a personal friend of the Prime Minister of the South, which allowed him not only to acquire enormous influence in the army, but also to control the police and the internal spy service. Starting in 1965, when the Americans became directly involved in the war, sending troops to fight communism, Loan was displeased. On the one hand, he was convinced that the Viet Cong had to be exterminated. On the other hand, he felt disgust towards Uncle Sam, and he did not like to see his troops roaming freely around the country, behaving as if they owned Vietnam. He also distrusted the CIA and believed in being cautious and keeping the Americans under strict surveillance. American President Lyndon B. Johnson detested Loan and saw him as a nuisance that prevented his troops from acting effectively. He pressured the South Vietnamese government to be removed from office, but the Asian country's prime minister refused to get rid of him. In the hours that followed the Tet Offensive, Loan was one of those patrolling the streets of Saigon, defending the city from aggressors. It was then that his soldiers announced to him that they had captured Nguyen Van Lem, the same one who, within a few minutes, would become the victim in the photograph. But before continuing, let's know the story of this man, since it is as interesting as that of his murderer. He was born in 1932, and his life was exactly the opposite of that of his future executioner. As a young man, he joined the Vietnam National Liberation Front, as he longed to see his country free from the clutches of Western powers. He was convinced that Ho Chi Minh's communist ideas were what would save the nation, so he joined the Viet Cong. Lem was no mere idealist, but was a man of action, who was willing to kill or die for the cause. For this reason, he joined the Tet Offensive, even knowing that it was a risky maneuver and that it was very likely that all the members of the operation would end up arrested or killed in combat. On January 30th, 1968, when the attack on Saigon began, the guerrilla went to a military barracks with his comrades to steal the tanks. Inside, they ran into a South Vietnamese Army Lieutenant Colonel, Nguyen Tuan. The officer was celebrating the party with his wife, his 6 children, and his 80-year-old mother. The Viet Cong demanded that he teach them how to handle tanks, but the colonel refused. Lem lost patience, pulled out a machete and charged at Tuan, hitting him again and again until his head rolled to the ground. Lem was responsible for an abominable massacre. After the carnage, he slipped through the streets of Saigon. He was sure that no one would catch him, since he was dressed in civilian clothes, and there was nothing that would allow him to be identified as a guerrilla. However, as he walked near the city cemetery, a South Vietnamese patrol recognized him. He was handcuffed and brought before Lone, who had already been informed that the prisoner was the Tuan murderer. The general was accompanied by a cameraman from the NBC News Network and a photographer from the Associated Press Agency, who had obtained permission to follow him and film everything that happened. They were the ones who recorded the images that you will see below. The execution left those present paralyzed. When Lone drew his .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, everyone thought he was going to use it to threaten the guerrilla. Nobody imagined that he would blow his head off there, in the middle of the street, and in the presence of the cameras. But the general was convinced that Lem was a wild beast who had to be eliminated as soon as possible. From his point of view, what he had done was unforgivable, and he did not deserve the possibility of defending himself in a trial according to the law. After having killed a father in front of his children and executed children and woman, the only justice he was going to have came from a gunshot to the temple. The communist fell on his left side. Streams of blood escaped from the bullet hole in his head, and after writhing for a few seconds, he died. Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams was an American specialized in war journalism. His enormous talent with his camera allowed him to capture the exact moment when the projectile destroyed the prisoner's skull and the power of the shot shook his hair. After the execution, General Lone turned and told the witnesses, "If you hesitate, if you do not do your duty, then your men will not follow you into battle." He dedicated the following words to the American reporter: "He killed many of my compatriots, and also yours." When Adams published the photograph, it traveled the world and became one of the best-known photographs of the Vietnam War. It was a clear example of the brutality with which they fought and the hatred that existed between the fighting sides. For many, it was also evidence that the South Vietnamese and Americans did not respect the rules of war. The story of the massacre of the guerrilla Lem did not spread with the same speed as the photo. When anyone saw her, they only saw an officer committing a ruthless crime against an unarmed prisoner. In 1969, the image won the Pulitzer Prize, journalism's highest award. However, Eddie Adams always regretted having damaged the general's reputation, since he believed that the execution was fully justified.
It's not nice, but I mean, he shot him. He was a prisoner, he shot him. I might have done the same thing. It wasn't until about a day later when we started getting reports back about what was going on with the picture. I had no idea of the impact, and I still don't understand it even today. General Luan, well, he was like a colonel, and the whole thing is the picture destroyed his life. And that's what bothers me more than anything else.
Shortly after the execution, Lone was interviewed in a book. When asked about the murder, he justified himself as follows: "The prisoner was not wearing a uniform, and I cannot respect a man who wages war without wearing a uniform. It's very easy, and it's cheating. You kill, and no one can recognize you. I have great respect for the North Vietnamese as long as they dress like soldiers, because it's the same thing I do. In doing so, we take a risk. But a Viet Cong that walks around camouflaged in civilian clothes, that fills me with fury." It is striking that the general has not denounced the guerrilla for having massacred a family. Several specialists claim that this was his opportunity to tell the truth, but he missed it. Months after his execution, Lone was shot in the leg while fighting against the communists. They had to amputate his limb, and from then on he stopped playing a central role in the army. In 1975, when South Vietnam lost the war, the general was evacuated to the United States, where he attempted to start a new life. He settled in Virginia, where he opened a typical Vietnamese food restaurant. However, his photograph haunted him until the end of his days. It was common for him to encounter protesters who shouted at him that he was a murderer and that he would pay for his crimes. Some representatives of the American Congress attempted to deport him to Vietnam to stand trial, but the initiative was unsuccessful. In 1991, he had to close his business because, due to his terrible reputation, he had almost no clients. In 1998, when he was 67 years old, he died of cancer. Today, Lone is remembered as a controversial figure. There are those who defend his actions, arguing that the guerrilla deserved the punishment. Others, however, maintain that what he did was an unjustifiable war crime. Ultimately, what is clear is that the Vietnam War led the troops involved to commit unforgivable acts, leaving their humanity aside and turning into beasts. We reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think Lone did the right thing by executing the guerrilla? Leave us your answer in the comments box below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.